It happens without warning. You are in the shower, or driving, or lying in bed at 3 in the morning trying to fall asleep, and suddenly, from nowhere, something surfaces. A moment from 7 years ago, something you said at a party that landed wrong, the time you called a teacher mum in front of the whole class, the job interview where you blanked on a question so basic that you still cannot think about it without wincing, the argument where you said the exact wrong thing and watched someone's face change. It rises with full sensory detail. The room, the faces, the specific texture of the humiliation. Your body responds, a small physical cringe, a flush of heat, a need to make a sound or move or think about something else. And then you spend the next 30 seconds trying to scrub it from your mind, wondering why your brain does this to you, wondering what possible purpose is served by ambushing you with social failures from half a decade ago while you are trying to rinse your hair. You assume the answer is none. Random neural noise, a brain misfiring, a malfunction of whatever system is supposed to let the past stay in the past. That assumption is wrong. These intrusions are not random. They are not noise. They are not a malfunction. They are a specific, purposeful cognitive mechanism that your brain has been running for reasons that are deeply connected to how social animals survive in groups. The cringe is not an accident. It is a signal. And once you understand what the signal is for, you will not be able to experience the cringe the same way again. The reason your brain does this is more interesting than you have been told, and more important to your behavior than you probably suspect. Here is the first crack in the standard picture. If intrusive, embarrassing memories were random noise, they would not have the properties they have. Random noise does not arrive with emotional content intact. Random noise does not arrive preferentially during idle moments. The shower, the commute, the period before sleep, rather than during focused work. Random noise does not skew so consistently toward a specific category of experience. Moments of social failure, violation of norms, exposure to judgment from others. The pattern is too consistent to be noise. If you surveyed 1,000 people about the content of their uninvited intrusive memories, you would not get a random sample of past experience. You would get a specific subset, moments of embarrassment, shame, social mistake, public failure, things said that should not have been said, silences that should have been filled. The specific category of experience that your brain keeps serving up uninvited is not random. It is selected. And here is the second crack. The timing is not random either. Intrusive memories arrive most reliably during what psychologists call default mode network activation, the brain state associated with mind wandering, internal reflection, and low-demand cognitive tasks. The shower, the drive you have taken 100 times, the minutes before sleep. These are not moments of cognitive rest. They are moments when a specific metabolically expensive brain network becomes most active. A network whose function is not processing the external world, but processing the social self. The default mode network was discovered almost by accident when neuroscientists noticed that a consistent set of brain regions showed higher activity during rest than during task performance. They expected the brain to quiet down when not engaged with an external demand. Instead, a specific network lit up. That network, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the angular gyrus, the hippocampus, is now understood to be involved in autobiographical memory, social cognition, perspective taking, and self-referential thought. When your brain is not doing anything else, it is doing something very specific. It is running social simulations. It is rehearsing, reviewing, and evaluating your performance as a social agent. And the memories it surfaces for review are not random samples of your past. They are the memories flagged as socially significant. The ones where something went wrong, the ones that carry unresolved information about how you are perceived by others. The cringe is not a malfunction. It is the brain doing its job. The question is what the job actually is. Humans are obligate social animals, not social in the loose sense of enjoying company, but social in the strict evolutionary sense. Our survival has depended, for the entire history of our species, on maintaining membership in a group. Expulsion from the group for most of human evolutionary history, was effectively a death sentence. No individual human is well equipped to survive alone. We have no claws, no significant speed, no thick hide, no reliable means of obtaining food without tools and knowledge that must be socially transmitted. What we have is each other. This means that the social brain, the neural machinery dedicated to tracking, modeling, and managing our relationships with other people, is not a luxury built on top of more fundamental survival hardware. It is survival hardware. The capacity to read social situations accurately, to predict how your behavior will be perceived, to maintain a viable reputation within your group. These are not soft skills, they are the core competencies of a social primate whose life depends on not being thrown out. Robin Dunbar's research on the relationship between neocortex size and social group size across primate species is the relevant context here. The enlarged human neocortex correlates with the complexity of our social networks, the need to track relationships, alliances, reputations, and social debts across a group of roughly 150 individuals. The computational demand of maintaining this social map is, quite possibly, the primary driver of the expansion of the human brain. We did not evolve big brains to do calculus. We evolved big brains to manage social complexity. In this context, embarrassment is not a malfunction. It is a precisely calibrated emotional signal that indicates a specific type of threat, a threat to your social standing, your reputation, your perceived adherence to the norms that define membership in good standing. The intensity of the embarrassment is roughly proportional to the perceived seriousness of the norm violation and the number and significance of the witnesses. A small gaffe in front of one person produces a small cringe. A significant public failure in front of many produces genuine mortification. The emotion is doing threat assessment, not random suffering. The key claim I want to make is this: the uninvited replay of embarrassing memories is not a passive failure to forget. It is an active simulation system running rehearsals of social failure scenarios for the purpose of improving future performance. This is sometimes called the simulation function of the default mode network. When the brain surfaces a memory of a social failure during a mind-wandering episode, it is not simply retrieving a record. It is running a simulation. It is re-examining the scenario. Who was there? What was said? What the social dynamics were? What you did? In order to extract lessons, identify what went wrong, model how it was perceived, and update the behavioral rules that govern your social conduct. This is why the cringe is productive, even though it does not feel productive. The aversive quality of the experience, the discomfort, the wince, the desire to stop thinking about it, is motivationally functional. An emotionally neutral replay of a social failure would be processed and discarded without generating the kind of attention and elaboration that produces genuine learning. The negative emotional content is what makes the simulation stick. It is what ensures the brain keeps running the simulation until something useful has been extracted. The research of Ari Kruglansky on lay epistemics and the broader literature on negative affect and cognitive processing supports this. Negative affect increases systematic, careful processing of information. Positive affect is associated with heuristic, fast processing. When you feel bad about something, you think about it more carefully. The cringe is an attentional signal. This matters, process it properly. And the specific content of what gets surfaced, the moment of norm violation, the public failure, the wrong thing said, reflects the social information most valuable to update. These are not random embarrassments. These are the scenarios that contain the most information about your social positioning, others' expectations of you, and the gap between your behavior and the norms of the group. The brain is not tormenting you. It is working a specific file. There is a second mechanism at work, distinct from the simulation hypothesis but complementary to it. It is called the Zeigarnik effect, after the Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who described it in 1927. Zeigarnik noticed that waiters in a cafe could recall the details of orders they had not yet delivered with great accuracy, but forgot those same orders almost immediately once they had been served. The incomplete task was held in a kind of active cognitive buffer. The completed task was released. The memory system appeared to preferentially maintain access to unfinished business. Subsequent research has shown that this effect extends well beyond restaurant orders. Unresolved social interactions, conversations that ended badly, conflicts that were never addressed, situations in which something was left unsaid, are maintained in a more accessible state than resolved ones. The brain treats social incompleteness as an open file that must be kept available until it is closed. The embarrassing memory that keeps surfacing uninvited is in most cases an unfinished social transaction. Something happened that violated a norm, created a rupture in a relationship, or left your social position in an uncertain state. The brain classifies this as an open file. It surfaces the file during mind-wandering episodes because it is still waiting for resolution. Each replay is implicitly an attempt to find that resolution, to reframe the event, to extract a lesson that converts the failure into a rule, to identify what should have been done differently so the file can be marked as closed. This is why the same embarrassing memory can surface repeatedly for years without losing its charge, while other memories of comparable age fade completely. The ones that persist are the ones the brain has not yet classified as resolved. The ones where you have not yet found a satisfying way to understand what happened and what it means for how you should behave in future. They stay active because there are still open questions in your social operating system. Not all embarrassing memories are the same. Neuroscience and psychology draw a distinction that is important here. The distinction between shame and guilt, and it changes what the brain is doing with the memory. Guilt is a self-evaluation focused on behavior. I did something bad. The object of the evaluation is a specific action. Guilt is typically associated with a motivation to make amends, to repair the damage done, to behave differently in future. It is, in psychological terms, a constructive emotion, uncomfortable but pointing toward action. Shame is a self-evaluation focused on identity. I am bad. The object of the evaluation is the self as a whole. Shame is typically associated with a motivation to hide, to withdraw, to avoid the people who witnessed the failure. It is, in psychological terms, a corrosive emotion. It produces avoidance rather than repair, and tends to amplify rather than resolve with time. The distinction matters for the cringe. When an embarrassing memory resurfaces and the associated feeling is primarily guilt, I behaved badly, here is what I should have done. Here is the rule I am updating. The simulation is working as intended. The brain extracts the lesson, updates the social model, and over time the emotional charge of the memory reduces. The file gets closer to closed. When the associated feeling is primarily shame, I am the kind of person who does things like this, others now know this about me, I am fundamentally exposed. The simulation tends to spiral rather than resolve. Each replay reinforces the identity threat rather than extracting a behavioral lesson. The file stays open because shame does not generate actionable updates, only reconfirmations of a negative self-assessment. The memory does not fade, it compounds. Understanding this distinction is practically useful. The brain's default mode replay mechanism is designed to produce guilt-style learning, to extract behavioral lessons from social failures. When the replay produces shame instead, the mechanism has been captured by a different process. The difference between a memory that surfaces a few times and then quiets, and one that has been haunting you for a decade, often comes down to whether the brain was able to extract a lesson or only a verdict. There is one more layer to the mechanism that is worth examining carefully. When you cringe at an old, embarrassing memory, you are not simply remembering the event. You are imagining how it appeared to others. You are running a simulation of their perspective, of what they saw, what they thought, what conclusions they drew about you. The cringe is not about what happened. It is about being seen. This is theory of mind, the capacity to model the mental states of others, operating in its retrospective mode. You are not just reviewing your own experience of the event. You are reconstructing the experience of the witnesses. You are asking, what did they see? What did it look like from outside? What did they think about me afterward? This is computationally expensive, and from a certain angle, irrational. The event was years ago. The witnesses have almost certainly forgotten it, or remember it very differently than you do, or did not assign it the significance that you did at the time. Research consistently shows that people overestimate how much others notice and remember their failures. A cognitive bias called the spotlight effect. You believe that your embarrassing moment was as salient to everyone in the room as it was to you. You are wrong. You were the center of your own experience. You were not the center of theirs. But the brain is not running these simulations to be accurate about what specific people are currently thinking of. It is running them because the social evaluation machinery evolved to be conservative, to overestimate the salience of your behavior to others, because the cost of underestimating social scrutiny is higher than the cost of overestimating it. A social animal that does not worry enough about how it appears will make more norm violations and accumulate more reputational damage than one that is slightly overcalibrated towards self-consciousness. The spotlight effect is not a bug. It is a conservative setting on a mechanism where false negatives are more costly than false positives. Here is what is actually happening when the cringe arrives at 3 in the morning. Your default mode network has activated in the absence of an external task. It is running its standard programs: social self evaluation, reputation modeling, behavioral review. It has surfaced a memory flagged as socially significant, a moment of norm violation or public failure that was encoded with high emotional salience and classified as an unresolved social transaction. It is running a simulation of that event from multiple perspectives, including the perspective of the witnesses, in order to extract whatever lesson has not yet been extracted and update the behavioral rules that govern your future conduct in similar situations. The cringe is not your brain malfunctioning. The cringe is your brain's social maintenance system doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is running social simulations during downtime in order to improve your future performance as a member of a group that your ancestors depended on for survival. The embarrassment you feel is the motivational signal that makes the simulation stick. It is the emotional tag that ensures the memory is processed carefully rather than discarded. Your brain is not punishing you, it is training you. This reframe has a specific practical implication. The instinct when the cringe arrives is to suppress it, to stop thinking about the embarrassing memory, to redirect your attention to make it stop. This is understandable. It is also working against the mechanism. The simulation is surfaced because there is still unextracted information in the memory. Suppressing it before that information is extracted means the file stays open. The brain will surface it again. The more effective response, and the one that the neuroscience points toward, is to run the simulation to completion. Not to wallow, not to shame spiral, but to actually ask, what went wrong here? What was the norm that was violated? What should have happened instead? What rule does this update? When you have answered those questions in a way that feels genuinely satisfying, the memory tends to lose its charge. The file gets marked as resolved. The brain stops serving it up because it has extracted what it needed. The cringe is a signal. Like most signals, it has a message. Listen to the message, and the signal quiets. Not everyone experiences intrusive, embarrassing memories with the same frequency or intensity. Some people cringe occasionally, extract the lesson, and move on. Others return to the same handful of social failures for years with undiminished charge. The difference is not a matter of having made more embarrassing mistakes. It is a matter of individual variation in the brain systems involved. The personality trait most associated with frequent high-intensity intrusive memory is neuroticism, a dimension of personality characterized by emotional reactivity, negative affect, and a tendency to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening. People high in neuroticism have default mode networks that spend more time in social self-evaluation mode and produce more negative content during that evaluation. The same event that produces a brief cringe and a behavioral update in someone low in neuroticism produces a sustained amplified replay in someone high in neuroticism. The brain mechanism is the same. The calibration is different. Higher neuroticism means the social threat detection system is set to a more sensitive threshold. It flags more events as socially significant, maintains them in the open file state for longer, and runs the simulation with higher emotional intensity. This is not inherently pathological. In an environment where social mistakes carry high costs, high neuroticism is an adaptive setting. The problem arises when the replay system amplifies beyond the point of useful learning into the territory of chronic rumination, when the simulation runs not to extract a lesson, but to compound a verdict. Rumination, the repetitive passive focus on distress and its causes and consequences, is the maladaptive version of the mechanism, where the adaptive version extracts a lesson and closes the file. Rumination loops without resolution. The difference neurologically involves the degree of executive control the prefrontal cortex exerts over the default mode network. In people who ruminate heavily, the regulatory pathway from the prefrontal cortex to the default mode network is less active. The simulation runs longer and with less direction because the cognitive system that would normally redirect and resolve it is less engaged. Feynman's personal relationship with error and failure was unusual in a way that is directly relevant here. He described making mistakes as interesting rather than mortifying. When he got something wrong, in a calculation, in an argument, in a public lecture, his dominant response was curiosity about why he had been wrong, rather than shame about having been wrong at all. The error was data. It told him something about the structure of the problem or the limits of his current model. This is functionally the guilt response to social failure, rather than the shame response, focused on the behavior and what it reveals, rather than on the self and what it proves. And it is the response that allows the default mode replay mechanism to work as designed. Surface the failure, extract the lesson, update the model, close the file. Feynman also had an unusual degree of comfort with public exposure of his own ignorance. He would say in front of large audiences that he did not know, that he had been wrong, that he had once believed something he now thought was false. He treated these admissions not as threats to his reputation, but as evidence of his ongoing engagement with the truth. The social threat that most people's brains respond to with maximum sensitivity, being publicly exposed as not knowing, as having failed, as having been mistaken, was for Feynman simply the condition of doing science. This is not to say Feynman never felt embarrassment. He was human. But the way he processed social failure, with curiosity rather than shame, with a focus on the lesson rather than the verdict, is precisely the cognitive stance that allows the brain's social simulation system to run to completion and close the file, rather than spiraling into the kind of chronic replay that serves no one. The lesson is not that you should not cringe. The cringe is the signal. The lesson is what you do with the signal when it arrives, whether you run the simulation to its natural conclusion or abort it in a way that guarantees it will return. Here is what I want you to sit with. The capacity for embarrassment is not a design flaw in the human mind. It is one of the prerequisites for being able to live in a group at all. An agent that does not experience embarrassment, that does not have a sensitive, continuous system for monitoring its own norm compliance and social positioning, is an agent that will accumulate reputational damage until it is excluded from the group. The social world requires self-consciousness. Self-consciousness requires a mechanism that flags violations. The mechanism produces discomfort. The discomfort is the price of membership. There is a thought experiment that is useful here. Imagine a version of yourself with no capacity for embarrassment, no cringe, no retrospective social simulation, no monitoring of how your behavior appeared to others. This version of you would be missing something that looks from the outside like freedom. No more 3 a.m. replays, no more wincing in the shower. Liberation from the internal audience. But this version of you would also be, in a very specific sense, socially blind. Without the feedback signal of embarrassment, you would have no reliable mechanism for detecting when your behavior had violated a norm, for learning from social failures, for calibrating your conduct to the expectations of others. You would make the same mistakes repeatedly without the signal that marks them as mistakes. You would be, in the clinical literature, approaching something like the social cognition deficits associated with certain personality disorders, characterized not by malice but by a genuine inability to register the impact of your behavior on others. The cringe is what prevents this. The 3 a.m. replay is the maintenance work of a social mind. It is uncomfortable precisely because the comfort is not the point. The point is the update. Feynman's first principle, you are the easiest person to fool, applies here in a specific way. The easiest version of self-deception available to a social animal is the belief that your behavior is fine, that others are not judging, that the norm violation was not significant, that the social failure does not need to be examined. The cringe is the brain's mechanism for preventing this particular self-deception. It surfaces the evidence that something went wrong and holds it in front of you until you have actually looked at it. The people who find the cringe most intolerable, who suppress it most aggressively, who most urgently redirect their attention away from embarrassing memories, are often the same people who are least able to learn from social failure, because they have trained themselves to abort the simulation before it runs to completion. The cringe is not the problem. The aversion to the cringe is the problem. Your brain is doing something sophisticated, expensive, and genuinely useful when it surfaces these memories at 3 a.m. It has flagged an unresolved social file. It is running a simulation designed to extract information that will improve your future conduct. The discomfort is motivationally necessary. The question is whether you are going to let the simulation run or abort it, and whether you understand now what you are choosing between. Here is the question I want to leave open. The social simulation system described in this video evolved in a specific environment. Small, stable groups of roughly 150 people, where your reputation was built over a lifetime of repeated interactions with the same individuals, where social mistakes had real and durable consequences for your standing and survival. The system is calibrated for that environment. It treats every social failure as potentially significant, every norm violation as potentially costly, every act of exposure to judgment as potentially threatening. We do not live in that environment. We live in a world of transient interactions with strangers, of digital audiences of thousands, of encounters that may last minutes and never recur. The social simulation system has not been recalibrated. It is running the same program on a completely different data set. The spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much others notice and remember your failures, was adaptive when you lived with those same people for decades. It produces chronic overvigilance in a world where most of the people who witnessed your embarrassing moment have forgotten it within hours and will never see you again. The open question is this. We know broadly what the mechanism is for. We know it evolved for a social world that no longer exists in its original form. We know that for many people it runs too hot, producing chronic rumination rather than useful learning, shame rather than guilt, avoidance rather than repair. We do not yet have a clear account of how to recalibrate it. Therapy approaches that work with the mechanism rather than against it, that use the labile window of memory retrieval to update the emotional content of social failure memories, that shift the processing from shame to guilt, that help the simulation run to completion, rather than aborting or spiraling, are showing real promise. But the question of how a social brain, calibrated for a small ancestral group, should navigate a world of 7 billion strangers is not solved. The next time the cringe arrives, you have a choice. You can suppress it, redirect your attention, make it stop, and guarantee that it returns. Or you can run it to completion, ask what went wrong, extract the rule, close the file. The signal has a message. Your brain went to considerable evolutionary expense to make sure you could not ignore it. What is yours trying to tell you?